With the release of Spider-Man Far From Home and the official end of Phase 3, I feel like now is as good of a time as ever to look back on all the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I will be looking back at all the films of the Infinity Saga and ranking all 23 of them from my least favorite to my most favorite. Keep in mind that just because a film is near the bottom of the list, that doesn't mean I think it's bad. To be honest, I don't think any of these films are flat out bad, so if one of your favorites isn't high on the list, that's still totally fine. Alright, with that, let's get started. Number 23, Iron Man 2. The best word I can use to describe Iron Man 2 is messy. There's a lot going on in this movie. Tony is dealing with life in the spotlight as Iron Man, while also trying to come to terms with his past relationship with his father, while also dealing with Nick Fury and Natasha, who are trying to get him to form an Avengers team, while also two people from his past, Whiplash and Justin Hammer, are trying to take him down. There's just too much going on, and it's not put together all that well. Some of these elements are pretty good. For example, Mickey Rourke as Whiplash works pretty well, but it's just that he isn't given much to do, especially in the second half of the film, where it shifts focus to Justin Hammer. And I know a lot of people like him, but honestly, I just find him to be really annoying. Speaking of annoying, I get what they're doing with Stark's character, and they don't exactly portray him poorly, but he's just not pleasant to watch. I know he's supposed to be a jackass, but you're still supposed to like him, and that doesn't really come across here that well either. Overall, nothing is really that bad, and the side characters work well enough, so even though I think this film is the worst of the MCU, if this is the worst, then honestly that's pretty damn good, all things considered. Number 22. Thor: The Dark World. This is the movie that most people say is the worst of the MCU. If Iron Man 2 was messy, this one is just dull. The characters, the plot, the villain, and even the visuals are all kind of dull, especially the Dark World itself, which looks about as boring as possible. One thing does stand out in this movie, though, and that's Thor and Loki's relationship. Seeing their dynamic in a post-Avengers world is very interesting, and it's handled well. The problem is that it's only there for about a third of the movie. The rest is devoted to stuff you just don't care about, even if you should. I mean, Thor's mom dies in this movie, and you end up just not really caring, which is pretty bad if that didn't really work emotionally. I do think it's better than Iron Man 2 because it's at least more cohesive, but there's really no reason to see this. Number 21. Ant-Man. I know a lot of people think this movie is quite good, and on the surface, I'd think I would like it as well. The idea of an older superhero training a younger one is a really interesting one. The problem is that that's just not what happens. Hank Pym is basically just your generic old mentor character, and the story's pretty basic too. That said, basic stories have worked for Marvel before, but they hinge on the main character, and honestly, I find Scott Lang in this movie to just be annoying. I think he's the only MCU protagonist I actively dislike. He constantly acts like a dumbass, which wouldn't really be a problem if it weren't for the fact that they constantly bring up that he's an electrical engineer and act like he's supposed to be the smart one. There are some nice visuals, and the fight scene on the train set is neat, but if I don't like the main character, and the other characters don't do much more than just exist there, well, even if the movie is fine, I can't exactly recommend it that highly. Number 20. Thor. Thor is basically Ant-Man, but with a more likable protagonist. Granted, I don't think Thor is great in this movie, but he's likable, and you understand his decisions even if they aren't always the right ones. That also applies to Loki and even Odin, who both make bad decisions, but again, given the scenarios, you do end up understanding them. The fish out of water story isn't anything super interesting, but it's not exactly done poorly. Though, like with the Dark World, the human characters are really nothing to write home about. Asgard, though, does look pretty cool, and I like how they sort of weave science into everything. The idea of the Bifrost being an Einstein-Rosen bridge was neat, for example. Ultimately, this movie doesn't do anything groundbreaking, but doesn't really do anything wrong either. It's just fine. Number 19. Iron Man 3. I see some debate as to whether Iron Man 2 or Iron Man 3 is worse. The thing is, I really only see one actual problem with Iron Man 3. It's just that problem is pretty big. The pacing is terrible. The plot itself is actually decently interesting, with Tony trying to cope with the trauma from the Battle of New York while being outsmarted by someone who wants to take him down. There are also a decent amount of good scenes, like Tony with the kid, and the action's actually really good. The problem is that they just don't fit together at all, and the movie suffers from this a good amount. Now, a lot of people complain about the twist involving the Mandarin, however, I'm still kind of conflicted about it. On the one hand, it is lame that the Mandarin character, who was legitimately pretty intimidating and interesting, turned out to be a complete fraud, but on the other hand, it is unexpected and kind of unique in that sense. I don't hate the twist, but I can understand why others would, and Aldrich Killian is just another bad guy in a suit, so yeah. While this film is messy like Iron Man 2, the pieces are for the most part pretty solid, so the overall picture just ends up being alright. Though, it could have been really great if things just worked together a little bit better. Number 18. Avengers Age of Ultron. Talking about this movie is odd. I came away from it thinking that there weren't really any problems with it, but I just wasn't as invested as I feel I should have been, and I can't really point to why. The best reason I have is that besides the new characters, there isn't really anything new in this movie. The action's good, and the characters still work off each other well, and the dialogue is solid, but at this point we've kind of seen that already. As for the new characters, the Maximovs are fine, but not exactly that interesting, and Vision is interesting in concept, but they don't really explore him that much. And while Ultron is a fun voice and personality, he feels like a step down. I mean, last time we had an alien invasion, and now we have a robot. I definitely don't dislike the movie, and if someone really liked this, I wouldn't think that they were weird about it, but I just find it to be kind of standard. Good standard, but standard. Number 17. The Incredible Hulk. This movie is often said to be one of the worst MCU films, so I don't think it's great. I mean, it is number 17. I think it's better than most people give it credit for. Edward Norton as Bruce Banner is definitely different from Mark Ruffalo, but I think it works here. He shows off the mental strain of someone in his position quite well. I also like how the film isn't just a straight-up origin story, thus making it stand out a little bit more compared to some of the other more standard origin stories. I also like General Ross in this movie. He's the antagonist, but he's principled about it. He sees the Hulk as a dangerous creature, which, I mean, he's not exactly wrong. He's not a phenomenal character, but he has more to him than, say, Malekith or Darren Cross. That said, the guy who turns into Abomination is pretty underwhelming, but then again, the fight scene at the end is the best action scene pre-Avengers. Overall, I like this movie more than I thought I would, so if you'd skipped over this because of what other people have said, give it a watch. You probably won't love it, but it might be better than you expected. Number 16. Captain Marvel. Oh hey, it's the film that people say is overrated, and actually, it's not that good, when the movie is totally fine. I mean, okay, is it up there with the absolute greats? No, but doesn't need to be. It's a totally enjoyable film with solid moments and characters. Actually, speaking of characters, one of the things that even people who like the film tend to say is that Brie Larson's performance was not good and that Carol Danvers has no personality. Did we see the same movie? I thought she was totally fine, and Carol was pretty clearly portrayed as someone who just gets shit done no matter what. This helps elevate this movie over the standard fish out of water story, since Carol doesn't mess around when she arrives on Earth. Of course, Samuel Jackson is great, and it's Nick Fury, and I like Talos as well. Again, I don't think this is an amazing film, but the fact that so many people seem to jump on this film and this character as being bad is just kind of weird to me. Number 15. Ant-Man and the Wasp. Considering I didn't really think the original Ant-Man was all that great, I had pretty low expectations going into this, and maybe because of that, I ended up liking this movie more than I thought I would. I think the biggest reason is Scott Lang, who is much more likable in this movie, particularly in terms of his relationship with his daughter, which is really touching. The movie also seems to fully embrace the silliness of these characters and scenarios and just runs with it all the way. It's not exactly a profound film by any stretch, but it's an enjoyably dumb action movie, and for that, it works. Number 14. Black Panther. Hey, it's the other film that everyone keeps saying is overrated, and I feel about the same as I do about Captain Marvel. It's good, just not great. The story and characters work for what they need to do. What elevates this up a bit is the design of Wakanda and its culture. The visuals are just so interesting, and the mix of African traditionalism and Western modernism is really interesting and creative. Now that said, I have heard people criticize the CGI of this movie. And granted, I don't think it's groundbreaking, but I also don't think it's as bad as people say. I mean, sure, if you slow it down and kind of zoom in, you can definitely see the imperfections, but I've seen this movie a few times now, and I don't really notice while actually watching it. On the other hand, you have Killmonger, who many say is one of the best villains in the MCU. I'm not quite there. I feel like they should have shown just a little bit more of his life, maybe as a flashback to shortly after his father was killed, so I could really get into this character's head. He's not a bad villain by any means, but I just didn't quite put him all the way at the top like some people do. Either way, it's still a good movie. Did it deserve the Best Picture nomination? No, but again, that doesn't make it the movie bad by comparison. It's still a totally solid movie, and glad I've seen it. Number 13. Captain America Civil War. The reactions to this movie I've seen are interesting. I remember when it first came out, many people said this is one of the best, if not the best, film in the MCU, while now I see more people saying it's not that great and is kind of overrated. I'm somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, the premise and plot is very interesting. The idea of a divide in the Avengers because of government overreach is compelling, especially since Tony is the one pushing for that overreach. And this perfectly clashes with Steve's idealism. The setup is there for a great conflict, and in terms of the conflict itself, the action it delivers is really well done, of course with the airport scene being the obvious standout. It also introduces Spider-Man and Black Panther in compelling ways, and in particular, I do like how the movie doesn't just wrap things up neatly at the end. Things aren't resolved, and the schism between Steve and Tony lasts throughout all of Phase 3. All of this sounds really great. My problem is that while I understand why Steve and Tony are at odds, I just feel like something's missing that actually leads to them physically punching each other. I mean, yeah, Bucky did kill Tony's parents, but that's revealed later, after the airport's fight. It seems like a really minor thing, but again, during that airport fight, I just had this nagging feeling in the back of my head that I missed something, and that took me out of it a little bit. Oh, and I know people like to say the villain in this movie is pretty compelling, but honestly, I just don't really buy how this guy managed to split the Avengers like he did. And then there's his name. Helmut Zemo is probably the dumbest name of anybody in the MCU. Look, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, and this is still overall a very solid movie, and I can totally understand why some people absolutely love it. I'm just not quite there, but I still like it quite a lot. Number 12. Iron Man. Looking back on this movie, it's interesting to think about how this began everything, because honestly, most aspects of this film aren't that great. The plot is standard, the side characters are pretty forgettable, and the villain is just boring. Pretty much everything about this movie is standard, except for one thing. Tony Stark. Robert Downey Jr. absolutely nailed this character, and they managed to perfectly strike that likable jerk balance that the sequels just couldn't quite recapture. This film, above all others, really points to how one character can totally make or break a movie. Try to imagine this movie with, say, Norton's Hulk. Even though that character's fine, it wouldn't be enough to elevate this movie to be as enjoyable as it is. It's really impressive what Downey and all others involved managed to pull off. I know a lot of people hold this film to an incredibly high standard, but despite how great Stark is, I do have to bring it down somewhat because, again, of all the generic stuff surrounding him. Either way, it definitely still holds up today, and at the time, certainly wasn't a bad place to start. Number 11. Captain America: The First Avenger. Before watching these movies, I didn't really know very much about the Marvel characters. Sure, I knew characters like Hulk and Iron Man existed, but I knew basically nothing about them. So when they got to Captain America, I was really wondering how they were going to take something as ridiculously silly as Captain America and actually make him believable and interesting, but they totally pulled it off. Steve is a very likable and relatable character, and by starting him off as a World War II mascot, the silliness of the moniker and the costume don't really get in the way. In fact, taking Steve from that role into active combat during the war is really compelling. I also like Red Skull in this movie. He does look a little bit stupid, but he's an entertaining baddie and probably the best villain pre-Avengers, though to be honest, that's not saying a whole lot. I place this above Iron Man because even though I do think Tony is a bit more interesting than Steve in these first movies, the overall narrative and design of this movie just makes everything a bit more solid. Both are great movies though, and it makes sense that people love both of these characters as much as they do now. Number 10. Guardians of the Galaxy. There's probably some of you watching this who think it's crazy that I have this ranked as low as I do. I know there are several people who think this is one of the absolute best MCU films. To me, it's basically a better version of Ant-Man and the Wasp. It's a dumb fun movie. I personally don't connect with the characters that strongly. I don't dislike any of them, but they just don't grab me like Tony or Steve. But what elevates this higher is the tone and visual style. This is a great example of CGI being used well, not to be realistic, but artistic. And this helps this film carve out its own unique flair. Stuff like the Starship Barricade on Xandar just sticks in your mind after seeing it, even if you don't connect with all the characters. I can definitely understand why some people do absolutely love this, especially if they do connect with these characters. And though I'm not quite there, I do enjoy this a whole lot. Number 9. Doctor Strange. This film reminds me of the original Iron Man. On the surface, most elements are good, but not great. And the plot is a fairly standard origin story, and the side characters, besides the Ancient One, who is pretty neat, are just fine. Strange himself is pretty engaging, but if that was it, this film would be good, but definitely not this high on the list. But while Stark made Iron Man great, what makes this movie great are the visuals. Like with Guardians, this is exactly how to use CGI in a way that's not realistic at all, but damn if it isn't a trip to watch. I would recommend this film even if people don't care about the MCU, just so they can see the visuals in this movie. It's rare that the visuals would elevate a film this much, and it kind of makes me sound childish to put as much praise on them as I do, but considering everything else about this film works fine, and just how unique and interesting the visuals are, I end up liking this significantly more than I thought I would. Number 8. The Avengers. I think this was the pivotal film that Marvel needed to do right. Looking back at Phase 1, a lot of those movies aren't that great, and if this ended up being a mediocre film, the MCU would have probably faded away and ended by now. But they delivered. The Avengers covers all the bases it needs to. It brings the characters together in a natural and organic way, the dialogue is fun and lends to some good interactions, and of course the action in the climax is really solid. There really isn't too much to say here, it's just fun. Number 7. Spider-Man Far From Home. I'm going to keep things a little bit vague in case anyone hasn't seen this yet. This film is really split into two halves. The first half is overall pretty good, but it suffers a bit from having a somewhat of an awkward tone. It's trying to balance the serious and emotional side of Peter dealing with feeling Tony's shoes with a lighthearted teenage humor and romance, and it doesn't quite get it 100%. It's not bad by any means, but it just feels a little off, especially since the story is not super interesting for the first half. Then there's a reveal and a twist, and everything just jumps into high gear. The action in the second half of this film is really good, and it definitely uses Spider-Man in ways that we haven't seen yet in the MCU. Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio also works really well. Some people say that he's a little bit boring at first, but that's kind of the point. I don't really want to say anymore, you'll understand once you've seen the movie. Overall, it's a really solid film whose main characters bring it up a bit despite a few parts that might not work completely. And also, that mid-credit scene may be the best one in all of the MCU, as it blows everything wide open in terms of what Peter will be dealing with going forward. Number 6. Captain America: The Winter Soldier. At this point in the MCU, the films had been fairly standard in tone. There were some serious moments and characters, but no one would have said any of these films up until this point were, quote, serious films. The Winter Soldier changed that. This film has a very serious story about corruption and Hydra taking over S.H.I.E.L.D. from the inside, with Steve, Natasha, and Bucky all caught up in the middle. Before Phase 3, this was pretty handedly most people's favorite MCU film, and it totally makes sense why. The action is intense, the plot is interesting, and the characters are forced into uncomfortable situations. It's just a really good, interesting movie that holds up extremely well. Number 5. Thor: Ragnarok. On the other hand, we have Thor: Ragnarok, easily the goofiest film of the MCU. I've heard some people complain that this film is too silly and should have been more serious, but we got 2 Thor movies previously that were more serious and they just weren't very memorable. This is the kind of movie that Thor needed. Even if every joke doesn't land, the movie just keeps going so you'll forget about any awkward moments real quickly. Speaking of awkward moments, Jeff Goldblum as the Grandmaster is so wonderfully weird and he works off Thor and Loki excellently. Hela is also crazy badass that works well too, and the other characters like Korg and Valkyrie are also enjoyable as well. The visuals are very colorful and alive and let the film stand out even more. Bottom line, this film is just a hell of a lot of fun, and if they continue with Thor in a similar vein, I'm all for it. Number 4. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. It seems the common consensus that most people like the first Guardians movie more, but for me, the sequel just worked better. To me, the sequel took everything that worked in the first movie and made it better. It's funnier, the plot is more interesting, the visuals are even more unique and stunning, and I actually did get attached to the characters. I felt the drama between Star-Lord and Ego, the connection between Yondu and Rocket, and the weird friendship between Drax and Mantis. I even got emotional from this movie, and not just from Yondu's death. In that way, this was perhaps the most surprising thing in the entire MCU, that freaking Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is an emotional film, but it is! And it doesn't sacrifice the style and humor that was present in the first. Like I said, I just think it's even better. I'm glad Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is back on track, and though we probably won't be seeing it until 2022 at the very earliest, if it's going to be this good, I can wait. Number 3. Spider-Man Homecoming. To be honest, I was never really a Spider-Man fan. I didn't dislike the character, but I had no connection to him really at all. So while I knew some people really liked this movie, I didn't come into it with any super high expectations, and yet I ended up really, really liking it. I think what works so well is that this is a movie about everyday people in this crazy superhero world that is the MCU. While films like Iron Man and Thor Ragnarok have great characters that you like, they're kind of in their own little worlds. Homecoming feels like you're seeing just random people figuring out what to do, and this comes through perfectly with Tom Holland's Peter Parker and Michael Keaton's Vulture. Peter is so likable and realistic that I honestly think he's my favorite protagonist in the MCU. He goes through the movie just doing what he thinks is right, even if he's not exactly correct, but you completely empathize with him the entire time, whether it's while he's Spider-Manning around or when he's just trying to deal with high school. By the way, as a teacher, I'd like to say that the Captain America PSAs are absolutely something a school would do. On the other hand, you have Vulture. Adrian Toomes is one of the absolute best villains of the MCU. Not only does he feel like a very realistic person, but he's also crazy intimidating. That car ride is perhaps the most tense moment in the entire MCU. All in all, it's because of this film that I would say I'm a Spider-Man fan. Number 2. Avengers: Infinity War. Take a step back for a minute and really think about this movie. It's a film that juggles over a dozen prominent heroes, all while introducing a villain who is supposed to be the climactic villain of the whole Infinity Saga. The fact that this film is as good as it is incredibly impressive, and it works for a few reasons. For one, the characters are all split into a few groups that each have their own tasks. This keeps the plot focused while not leaving anyone behind or shoving characters together in a way that feels artificial. Also, since we've already been introduced to everybody, this leaves room for the movie to spend time focusing on the big bad himself, Thanos. Now, when I first watched this movie, I didn't immediately connect with Thanos. He was intimidating and had a great presence, but I felt like I was missing something about his character. Only at the very end of the movie did I realize what it was. I was assuming that there was some ulterior motive, and that killing half the universe was just the first step in a plan to gain control, or I don't know, something. But the fact that that's it is the brilliant part. Thanos is a villain who isn't actually benefiting himself directly. He sees what he is doing as something that must be done, not because he wants to. I mean, he's completely wrong and is a goddamn psychopath, but this makes his character just super interesting to me. And of course, the ending is devastating, even if you know about it beforehand. Given how Age of Ultron didn't have the best reception, they absolutely nailed it here, and they deserve all the credit for pulling this off. And number 1, Avengers: Endgame. Yeah, I know it's the cliched choice, but I just couldn't justify anything else. Here's the thing. Is this movie perfect? No. You could argue some characters like Captain Marvel aren't really used, and hell, Okoye basically wasn't used at all, and there are some oddities with the time travel stuff, but here's the thing. Your enjoyment of a movie doesn't just come down to how many things did they do wrong. It's an emotional experience, and on that front, Endgame absolutely delivers. Endgame is basically split into 3 parts. The first is dealing with the aftermath of Infinity War and preparing for the time heist. Some people complain that this part is slow, but honestly I think it should be slow. They really give you time to see how all these characters have been trying and often failing to cope with what has happened, and you need to spend time on that. The second part is the fan service with time travel, and this is fan service done right. They don't just point at something and say, hey, look at that. They actually do things with it and provide more insight. Hell, Thor's conversation with his mom is way more impactful here than her death in the Dark World. And there are other fun moments that shine throughout this hour. And then you have the climax and the ending, which are about as perfect as they could be. The emotions are just so strong here, both with the hype and excitement, and also the sadness and mourning. For a finale to the original 6 Avengers, I really don't think they could have done things much better. Again, they all just deserve so much credit for bringing everything together in such a satisfying and powerful way. So that's it. Phase 4 is set to begin in May 2020, and I honestly can't wait for more. To be honest, I actually hadn't seen a single MCU film before 2017, and even then, the vast majority of these movies I saw within the last 9 or so months. I think the biggest takeaway here is that we should all be grateful for these movies. Sure, they're not absolutely amazing, but the consistent level of quality is extremely impressive given how many franchises fail after just a few entries, even if they start strong. I hope things continue to go well, and I'll be looking forward to what the future brings. Until then, see you next time.